Hello everybody and welcome to another F1 Roundup brought to you by the brilliant Seedstream app. It was of course the Dutch Grand Prix this weekend. It was interesting. It wasn't the most exciting of races, but it did raise a number of key points, a number of things that I think we've learnt, a number of questions that we now need to ask, and that is exactly what I'm going to cover in today's video. It's brought to you, as I said, by Seedstream. I was at the Silverstone Festival this weekend working, which meant I didn't get a chance to watch all of the TV coverage, and the Seedstream app became invaluable. Not only, of course, does it give you all of the results, all of the session, the timings, all those kind of things, but it importantly gives you all the storylines behind those results from the journalists and the content creators that I trust. And that meant that over the course of the weekend, I could follow in some detail what was happening without actually being able to watch it all. It's a free app. I highly recommend you go and give it a go. There'll be a link in the description of this video, but also you can just search the word Seedstream in any of your app stores. Give it a try and let me know what you think. Right, the Dutch Grand Prix. Of course, huge congratulations to McLaren and to Lando Norris. Not just for the win, because of course that's a great result, something that they, the team, and Lando particularly, if he's got any hope of a championship fight, needed, but also because it's representative of where McLaren are right now. They are now by far the fastest team consistently over a wide variety of circuits, and that is what's most important here. They brought more upgrades to the car, and again they seem to work and deliver performance. Now this is something that's so important right now, because a lot of teams we're seeing, and Bull are one of those, bringing upgrades to the car and not necessarily getting the results that they would have hoped for or expected. And there's a number of reasons and complications behind that. I think we're in an era of Formula One at the moment. We're in a phase where tyre temperature is always very important, but I think a number of teams are getting a little bit lost with tyre temperature and can't seem to figure out why one week their car seems to work, the next week on a different type of circuit or in different track temperatures and conditions, it simply doesn't. And the swing seems enormous. And you've only got to look at Ferrari and Mercedes over the course of this Dutch Grand Prix weekend as a real example of that. Both teams a little bit lost. Ferrari lost as to why they were so good in the race. Mercedes a bit lost as to why they were so terrible in the race. It all comes down to this very narrow setup window in which they get their tyres to operate. And you should never underestimate just how powerful having your temperatures in that correct temperature window is for the performance of a Formula One car. It can literally be the difference between it working and it not. And in a tight Formula One field, that can push you up or down the grid by 5, 6, 7 places, as we've seen on occasions. But from McLaren's point of view, they've got their car in a window that seems to operate very well across a variety of different condition sets. And that's so valuable, so important. They've also got, as I said, the upgrades that are coming out of the factory through their wind tunnel and CFD development time are working. So whatever they're doing in the factory, whatever results they're getting back at base are translating onto the real car. And as we've seen many times in the past, that is not always the case. And when it isn't the case, it's really very frustrating because you become a bit lost. If we look at Red Bull, they split their two cars across two different configurations of floor and aero setup. And the part of the reason for that is because they're lost. They don't really know or understand exactly where their performance has gone. They've brought upgrades recently to their car at Red Bull that just haven't worked. And it's been frustrating, it's cost them. And it means they're now searching around for answers at a time when they really need to just be delivering performance week on, week out, week in, week out, which is of course what McLaren are exactly doing. So is there a championship fight on? For the constructors, 100%. The championship battle for the constructors, even though there is still a deficit, is in McLaren's favour because of everything I've just said to you. They've got two drivers very much capable of bringing big points hauls, and I think that'll be the case at most weekends. Oscar Piastri this weekend had a slightly difficult race because of that poor start, and that is definitely something that McLaren need to get on top of. We'll come to that in a moment. But in terms of the Constructors' Championship, with both of their drivers being pretty much as quick as each other, bar a tenth or two, on any given weekend, it could be one or the other of them at the front. and whoever is at the front, the other one should be very close behind. Had Oscar not had a poor start and dropped places behind George Russell in the Mercedes, I think it wouldn't have compromised his race in the way that it did. He spent almost his entire race stuck behind somebody in that dirty air, which meant he wasn't able to make the progress he needed to get forward. But had they had clean starts, I suspect McLaren could have come away with a 1-2 here, and that would have been incredibly helpful in the Constructors' Championship. If that's the case moving forward, Red Bull have got a very difficult task on their hands to hang on to the lead that they have at the moment, because whilst Max Verstappen is still doing a great job in a car that is definitely not the quickest, his teammate Sergio Perez started 5th, only finished 6th this weekend, and yet Christian Horner was talking about that as a really solid drive. If that's about as solid as you're going to get from Sergio Perez in that Red Bull car, that is not going to be enough to get you a Constructors' Championship by the time we get to the end of this season. They have got work to do. They've got work to do in terms of finding out exactly what's gone wrong in terms of performance, but also how do they address that? How do they bring components and parts and upgrades? How do they fine-tune the setup of their car so that they can get the most out of it, so they can maximise what they have? They haven't got a slow car. Max Verstappen still finished 2nd yesterday. Most of the grid would have been very happy with that. But coming from where we know he was earlier in the season, that brilliant performance that built up the championship lead that they have now disappeared some way from that. So in the Constructors' Championship, I think McLaren, you'd even call them favourites right now, because their car seems to work across almost all circuits. And if you look at the races coming up, we think at Monza, of course, I'm sure Red Bull will be quick around there. But in a couple of races' time, we go to Singapore. And that's a circuit that Red Bull have consistently struggled at. Even last year, when they were really dominant, they could not find the pace in Singapore. Well, if they find themselves down in sort of 5th or 6th places, with McLaren being able to take 1 and 2, well, that completely swings the championship tally in terms of points in both championships. Things could very quickly change if Red Bull have an off day and McLaren continue to have good days. So that's the Constructors' Championship. In the Drivers' Championship, it's always been a little bit fanciful, hasn't it, to talk about Lando Norris having a genuine shot at the world title, given the size of Max Verstappen's lead in the championship. He's still got a 70-point advantage over Lando Norris. But for the first time, I'm starting to wonder, is it really insurmountable? And the reason I say that is because there's not just McLaren and Red Bull in this. As I said earlier on certain days, you'll find Ferrari very quick. Again, Singapore was a real strong point for them last year. Other days you'll find Mercedes have found some form and can find themselves almost dominating the field. We've seen that in recent races. Now, whether or not they take points off McLaren, who genuinely look like the quickest car by some margin, certainly at some circuits, they could certainly start to take points off Red Bull. As I said, I think in last week's video, it could be that somebody like Mercedes could be a threat to McLaren because they could start taking points off each other, off the two McLarens, which would hurt a championship challenge clearly. But it could well fall that they turn out to be in the little gap between McLaren and Red Bull. And even if it isn't Max Verstappen, as long as it's Sergio Perez, it's limiting the amount of points that Red Bull are able to score over the remainder of this season. And therefore, when they're not being able to work as a team, which they'll need to do at certain races, this could really impact both championships. So I actually think that it's not beyond the realms of possibility that Lando Norris could well be in the hunt for a title challenge by the end of this season. He won that race yesterday, yes, by a dominant margin, and I don't buy into the whole numbers. The gaps between the leader and the second place driver are almost meaningless because you drive to the situation. You know, Lando had built up a pit stop gap towards the end of that Grand Prix, which is a sensible thing to do given the pace he had, just in case of any eventuality where he might need it. He could have probably gone quicker. He set the fastest lap of the race on the final lap, so he still had loads of performance left in those tyres. Max Verstappen, on the flip side, had pretty much settled into second place. He knew he couldn't challenge Lando, so he backed off. He was conserving things. He was just nursing his car round to the end. Also, totally sensible thing to do. So the actual gap means nothing, but the dominant performance definitely does mean something, and that is what is now worrying Red Bull moving forward. They have seriously got to do some work to up the performance of their car and try and get both of their drivers into the hunt for big points every weekend. Let's look at McLaren's starts, because in recent races the poor start, the poor opening laps from Lando or McLaren in general have cost them. They've cost them quite dearly. But you could definitely argue, as I said, that Oscar Piastri's poor start yesterday did cost him some serious points and positions. Lando got away with it, such was the dominance of his drive and the fact that he only had one car in front of him at the end of the opening lap, not the three that Oscar Piastri had. It made it far more difficult for Oscar to move forward, because Lando was able to get past Max Verstappen, who was struggling with a very high downforce setup on the Red Bull, which meant that along that straight with DRS, Lando was able to breeze past without too much trouble and then go off into the distance. So McLaren definitely need to sort their starts out. And I wonder if it's still part of this same dilemma that a lot of teams are suffering with that I just talked about. This idea of struggling to understand the tyre temperature conundrum, which is always a conundrum in Formula One, but it feels like there's an element of unknown in terms of maybe ambient temperatures or track temperatures and how the tyres are interacting with those. And if you're not prepared and got them in exactly the right temperature window, you just don't generate the grip that you would imagine you would, and therefore perhaps your start procedures have all been off, because when you figured all those things out, temperatures were different a couple of days ago, as they were this weekend. So it could well just come down to tyre temperature and the amount of grip that they thought they were going to have off the line compared to what they actually did have in the different conditions of Sunday. And therefore, Lando got a whole load more wheel spin, as did Oscar. But everyone else, of course, seemed to do a better job in that regard. And that'll be the question that McLaren are seriously looking at through their data, through the feedback of drivers and engineers, and trying to figure it out for next time. It's certainly a weak point for them at the moment. Luckily, their performance is able to overcome it on racetracks like Zandvoort. As for the race yesterday, I think a lot of people were caught out, to some extent at least, by the fact that tyre degradation just simply was nowhere near as extreme as most people thought it would be. I think you could even argue that Red Bull tried to counteract what they thought was going to be high deg by putting maximum downforce on the car to try and protect those tyres. Of course, as soon as you start sliding the car, you start chewing through tyres very quickly, you wear them out, they degrade, and you have to come in for more pit stops. Pretty much what happened to Mercedes over the course of the race yesterday, exactly that same scenario. But Red Bull tried to go for a higher downforce setup to try and protect against that, to give them the grip. They could lean on the tyres, hoping that that would give them better tyre deg than the likes of McLaren over the course of Grand Prix. The reality was the actual natural tyre degradation wasn't anywhere near as bad as most people suspected it was going to be. And that meant that high downforce setup that Max Verstappen had on his car simply didn't work. And it meant he was a sitting duck when it came to that overtake from Lando Norris along the straight. Just couldn't keep up, had nothing to match for the pace of the McLaren. And maybe they got that slightly wrong with a bit of hindsight. So the battle is definitely on at the front. And at the moment, I feel like I'm swinging slightly and my money is now on Lando Norris and McLaren. I genuinely think they can do it. They're in good form. Everybody and everything at that team is working well. And you can't necessarily say the same at Red Bull. It feels like it's destabilised a little bit, not just in terms of performance, but the comments coming out of the team. And you know, I remember in one of these videos earlier on in the season when the Christian Horner controversy was bubbling up, I talked about the fact that they had such an advantage in their car back then. The only thing that might actually stop them was Red Bull themselves, almost imploding behind the scenes. And to some extent, although that might be an exaggeration, it feels like that's just starting to happen now. It feels like every week we've got another little dig from Jos Verstappen or Christian Horner trying to defend something that seems indefensible. It's not all plain sailing. There are people leaving, there are people moving around. Lots of stuff is changing at Red Bull right now. And the one thing that we still don't know yet, and there's lots of rumours around this, the talk of whatever the engine department at Red Bull are going to be able to deliver in 2026, which is of course a big part of what Max Verstappen will need to know before making any decision about moving, is something that internally they will of course have some idea about. Max Verstappen will be being told certain things. Max Verstappen and Jos Verstappen will know certain things that we don't, and they will all inform opinions about where he might drive next. Toto Wolff has been very, very open about the courting of Max Verstappen. Seems like the fight for him in 2025 is already off, but 2026 seems like it could definitely happen. And why wouldn't it? You know, Mercedes are a team that have scope to improve. They're on the up. They're heading in the right direction. I know this weekend didn't go well, but the general trend at Mercedes is they're heading back in the right place, in the right direction. The trend at Red Bull is going the opposite way. And even more so than just car performance, what's happening behind the scenes, I think, is something that Max doesn't want. He doesn't want the messiness that's going on there. Jos Verstappen certainly doesn't want it. And I can very much see that move happening at some point. And talking of moves, let's wrap this up with talking about Williams, because Logan Sargeant, it feels like he's just putting the final nails in his own coffin this weekend at Zandvoort with that what seemed like an unnecessary crash. Straight after the summer break, he had a disastrous race before the summer break, went away, had some rest and recuperation, and he needed to come back strong, and he didn't. He did the opposite of that. And the reason it's such a problem for Williams is these crashes, and this one was a big one, are costing millions and millions of dollars. That's millions of dollars out of a very tight budget in Formula One these years, where if you're spending money on rebuilding cars, making new components like chassis, floors, wings, they're very expensive stuff, you're not able to spend that same money on development, on bringing new upgrades, on making the car go faster, which of course is what every team in the pit lane right now is trying to do. I talked last time out about the importance of upgrades now in this phase of Formula One before we get into 26, when everyone wants to spend and divert their budget onto the new cars that are coming in the end of 25 and the beginning of 26. No one wants to be in a big development race next year, so that has to happen now in the 2024 budget. And yet Williams are, spending their budget on repairing one of their two cars almost every single week. I think it's going to happen that he will be changed. I suspect any day now we'll hear that announcement, and it seems more and more likely that replacement for him for the end of the season will be Mick Schumacher. He is the Mercedes reserve driver, and of course Williams have a relationship with Mercedes. There was talk about Liam Lawson coming in, but I think the complications with that are that actually Red Bull might need him themselves. Red Bull have no idea yet whether Sergio Perez will be good enough to see out the rest of the season. They want to keep their options open, that if they need him, they can have him back. And Williams, I think, will be unlikely to want to commit to somebody like Lawson in their car, with the caveat they might have to give him up again in a couple of races' time if things don't pan out the way that Red Bull hope they will there. So I suspect it's going to be Mick Schumacher coming in till the end of the season. It really will just be a stopgap. But for Mick, it could be a real audition. He's looking for a drive, a full-time drive on the grid for next year. It seems like an outside shot, but if he can put in some good performances in a competitive environment of a Formula One weekend in a Williams, that will do him no end of favours. All of these stories and more, of course, you can find in the Seedstream app. This is a place where all of your most trusted journalists and content creators, all of their stuff gets put into one simple to use place, the Seedstream app. It's completely free, and I highly recommend you go and download it, either via the link in the description of this video or by searching Seedstream wherever you get your apps from. Thank you so much for watching, guys. The Italian Grand Prix is just around the corner, so I'll be back with more after that. Enjoy it, have a wonderful week, and I'd love to know what you think of Seedstream if you try it. Let me know in the comments. Cheers, bye-bye.